Hello, everybody. I don't often begin these events, but I feel so strongly about this one for reasons I'll explain that I just want to say a few words before this wonderful and timely panel begins. 2 days after I graduated from the college in 1976, I walked into the Chicago Tribune newsroom as a reporting intern. And at that time, it was a huge ornate space, 3 stories high with an observation deck surrounding it. What the public could glimpse from there were many hundreds of people working in a bustling nerve center, including some of the greatest journalists, not just in Chicago, but in the world, and more than a few Pulitzer Prize winners who had shined a bright light in the dark corners and held local and state government accountable. The newsroom sat in this Gothic Tribune tower on North Michigan Avenue. Across the street were the headquarters of the Sun-Times and the now defunct Chicago Daily News. Today, the tower has been sold for condominiums, and the Sun-Times building has been raised to make way for the Trump Tower. These are graphic symbols of what has happened to local news. The classified advertising base that was key to the profitability of local newspapers has been destroyed by the internet. And while national news operations have been able to transition successfully to a subscription model, many local news outlets have not. These great Chicago newspapers, vital civic assets, have been depleted and scavenged. Their newsrooms and ambitions have been shrunken. Their very survival is in doubt. And this story has been repeated all over the country, where one after another venerable news organization has been shuttered. And we should be clear, this is a crisis for our communities, and it's a crisis for our democracy. So I'm really gratified for this timely panel and the learned panelists who are joining us today. And here to introduce them is Eric Snyder.
Thank you everyone for being here. Thank you, Mr. Axelrod, for your opening remarks. Really drove home exactly why we're here today. So I'll try my best to follow up. My name is Eric Snyder. I'm a 7-year Army vet, first-year student at University of Chicago, double majoring in economics and religious studies, and a current writer for the Institute of Politics student-run online publication, The Gate. The University of Chicago and the Institute of Politics are happy to bring you breaking local news under pressure. Today, our panelists will be discussing the importance of local news, some of the challenges being faced by many local newspapers around the country, brought about by the increasing digitization of our world and changes in consumer preferences for their mediums of choice when it comes to accessing news, and what the future of local news may look like. Joining us on our panel is Michael Klingensmith, publisher and CEO of the Minneapolis Star Tribune and University of Chicago College and Booth School of Business alum, Nykia Wright, CEO of the Chicago Sun-Times and Crane Chicago 40 Under 40 class of 2018 alum, and Tom Rosenstiel, Executive Director of the American Press Institute, founder of the Project for Excellence in Journalism, and author of novels such as Shining City, The Good Life, and Oppo. Moderating the event will be CEO and co-founder of Chalkbeat, co-founder and board chair of the American Journalism Project, and author of New York Times bestseller, Building a Better Teacher, Elizabeth Green. Once again, thank you all for joining us. Hope you enjoy our seminar. Now I'll turn it over to our moderator, Ms. Elizabeth Green.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Thanks to the IOP for drawing attention to this important topic. Nykia, I thought I'd start with you and we can have the conversation sort of describes the problem a little bit more deeply, and then we'll move into some solutions. You are a turnaround expert known for turning around businesses that are struggling. Can you describe a little bit more detail than we heard from David Axelrod about the trajectory that led the Sun-Times to needing a turnaround expert to come in and take the helm?
Absolutely. So thank you so much for the invitation. I think this is so timely. David's preamble certainly set the stage for helping us understand the true economic challenges that this industry is facing. And so in Chicago, what's interesting is, from what I understand, the Tribune was on a 5 to 8 year campaign to assume the Chicago Sun-Times. That's not different if you think about all of the consolidation around the industry. 5 of the top 10 publications, and a publication could be as many as 200 brands, are owned by private equity firms and hedge funds around the country. Just in 2020 alone, you had 22 publications either consolidate or close in the state of Illinois. So make no mistake about it, we are creating news deserts around the country. Where there is consolidation, the question is, to me, an economic one. Whether we appreciate private equity firms or hedge funds for what they do, I think implicit in everyone's goal. Now the implementation may be have gone awry, but the implicit goal that everyone has is to somehow save this industry through economies of scale and economies of scope. The debate can go on and on for that. But if I tie this back to the Chicago Sun-Times, over the last 3 years that I have been there, just from our cost model alone, we have pulled out $17 million of costs, and none of that was attributed to labor. Yes, we've laid a few people off, but at the end of the day, we've sort of replaced them either in that seat or in another seat. So if you just marinate on that for about 10 seconds, right? You've got a single shingle newspaper. So it's not that I have am in control of multiple brands, that has pulled out $17 million of fat in an organization. We haven't been doing something right. And so now that reckoning is here.
And let me just pause you there. So how did the Sun-Times is independently owned, not owned by a private equity company and not owned by a large chain, correct?
We are owned by a group of investors, but it's one brand that is owned. So it's not the Chicago Sun-Times plus the Daily Herald plus. So we've got very benevolent benefactors who have had patient capital to help us stay alive.
And can you describe how that happened? How did the Sun-Times avert a different trajectory?
Yes, so this is also interesting. And so all of this also is from my own understanding, right? So I want to be very careful here since we're talking about journalism and making sure that we don't have an ambiguous relationship with the truth. It is my understanding that the Chicago Sun-Times, there were 2 weeks essentially that the investor group had because of antitrust concerns that were cited, 2 weeks for a group of investors to cobble together enough millions of dollars to sort of snatch it from the jaws of the Tribune at the time. Once they did that and were thrown the keys to the organization, we were off to the races in terms of our independence. That happened around July of 2017, and I joined in October of 2017.
And why are you describing the Tribune as having jaws?
When you think about the consolidation, when you think about one company assuming another, I consider that snatching us from the jaws of another company.
And this, let's step aside from the Tribune for a second. That's a long, complicated story.
Right.
But
Yes.
Can you describe what was the group that, there were 2 groups successively that attempted to do this rescue to independence. Who were they?
So it was a hodgepodge group of, you had labor unions and you had just regular investors who were coming together to actually save the paper. And so that was in July of 2017.
But the labor groups no longer own the paper, is that right?
The labor groups are still investors. You've got primary investors and secondary investors, but the labor groups are very much still invested in a part of the paper.
And so can you, and then just one more thing, step back a bit. What was the scope and size of the Sun-Times 20 years ago? And what is the scope and size of the Sun-Times at the time of the rescue?
At the time of the rescue, we were really hemorrhaging, right? So of all of the people that recognized that people could leave, the organization ended up leaving. So we were a shell of a company. When you think about the average newspaper and the number of beats that they have to have that diversity of thought to bring to the paper, we did not have that. We were hemorrhaging. When you think about 20 years ago, in between then, you had Hollinger who owned it. At that time, there was a consortium of newspapers. There was a bankruptcy. There are so many things that are sort of wrapped up in 20 years, the ebbs and flows. But in 2017, it was very much a shell of a company that was very much on life support in terms of the number of journalists and then the number of people on the business side.
So give us a sense of what that number of journalists was in 2017 and how that compared to the paper at its height.
So the paper at its height, I'll be honest with you, I don't know that exact number, right? So, but as of 2017, we were down to 100 journalists. At any given point, there were way more than that if you're talking about Canadian newspapers and other newspapers that were in the suburbs. So before I joined, and before they sold 32 publications to the Chicago Tribune, think about 32 small newspaper companies around the state that were once part of the Chicago Sun-Times.
And now, so the hemorrhaging reduced the size of the newsroom. You don't know exactly how much, but significantly.
Absolutely. Certainly from a brand perspective, if you go from 32 publications to one, right, you can determine size and scope just by that statistic alone. The number of journalists that supported these 32 publications, that predated me 3 or 4 years, so I don't know the answer to that.
Right. Okay. And I'm going to bring Tom into the conversation at this point. Tom, you sit at a vantage point where you're watching the overall journalism industry and studying trends. How does the story of the Sun-Times fit into this bigger picture of a declining local news landscape?
Well, the Sun-Times in some ways is unusual in that there are only, I don't know what the number is now, but probably fewer than 12 metropolitan areas in the United States that have 2 newspapers.
That's correct.
And the number used to be 18, and in a number of markets where those exist, they have something called a joint ownership rule, which means they share revenue. So there are very few.
This is the story that Nykia was telling about consolidation.
Yeah, that consolidation, the joint ownership rules actually went into effect in the 1960s. I mean, the notion that journalism is a sort of static thing, and that there was this period of time and suddenly the internet happened and things started to change, that's actually an oversimplification.
Right.
You know, television happened in the 1950s, and we went from having multiple newspapers and afternoon newspapers in most markets to having one newspaper. The Chicago was unusual in that 2 newspapers survived. Some of the reasons for that are political, that the Chicago Tribune was a conservative newspaper for many, many years, considered anti-union, considered kind of anti-Semitic for a long time, very anti-Roosevelt. The Sun-Times was created so that there could be a pro-Roosevelt newspaper in Chicago. A lot of that legacy continued for many, many years. Anyway, in the 1960s, most American cities began to reduce down to one newspaper. Newspapers became a more elite medium. Demographics became very important. And the afternoon newspaper in America was largely replaced by local television, which was a kind of more working class medium. I mean, the afternoon newspapers were more working class kind of publication. They were aimed at people who got up and went to work early and didn't have time to read the newspaper until the afternoon. And local television replaced that. So now, in other ways, the Sun-Times is very typical, and that is that advertising used to support newspapers nationally. If you wanted to reach people in a community, if you wanted to reach people in Chicago, particularly with information that was specific, like toasters are on sale at the department store this week, you should go get one. And this is the reduced price, or in coupons and things like that. You went to newspapers and they could charge a large amount of money for that advertising. The internet blew that apart. 60 to 70% of all digital advertising dollars in the United States today go to 2 companies, Facebook and Google. So that's revenue that once belonged to, that once supported journalism, that is now essentially supporting platforms and not journalistic activity. And that's the story. It wasn't actually the disruption in digital disruption to newspapers was not actually an audience crisis as much as it was a revenue crisis.
And Tom, just a bit more about that, because I think this is a point most people have misconceptions about. Did subscriptions, what was the share of revenue of subscriptions from the overall newspaper revenue relative to advertising, even at the height of newspapers?
Yeah, so this is an important point. Newspapers, media in the United States in particular has been advertising driven. Television news was free, right? And newspapers price themselves so that they could get as large an audience as possible, and then they would leverage that audience to advertisers. So the business model was a kind of bank shot, or a triad. And the kind of rule of thumb in the United States was that about 80% of revenue to a newspaper came from advertising, about 20% from subscriptions. Now, in some other countries, it's different. In Britain, for instance, it's almost the inverse of that. Well, since 2010, roughly, those numbers have inverted or begun to invert. At the New York Times, the revenue is probably close to 70% from subscription now. Why has that inversion happened? Partly that's because advertising has vanished, and partly it's because you can get digital subscriptions and amass a much larger percentage of people who will pay for the publication.
But
that's happened nationally.
The overall pie has reduced significantly.
Yes, the advertising revenue has dropped. And Mike can cite these numbers better than I can, but advertising revenue has dropped by more than half since 2005. My view, maybe I'm jumping ahead. My view is that the solution for newspapers is not to actually have one revenue base, but for subscriptions to make up the lion's share.
Yeah, let's pause you there, and we'll get into this. And I want to bring you in, Michael. Let's talk about Minneapolis and the Star Tribune, because I think it is another exception to the story in some ways in terms of retaining independent ownership, but it's also proves the story of declining size and scope. So can you talk about the history of the Star Tribune in Minneapolis?
Yeah, so I've been at the Star Tribune for 11 years. And in that period of time, we are unusual in that we've been exceptionally stable. So for example, we have 240 people in our newsroom. That is almost precisely the number that were there when I got there. We've dedicated ourselves to keeping the newsroom and our news report vibrant and healthy. We've dedicated ourselves to keeping the print publication strong. And we've dedicated ourselves at the same time to building a digital subscription model. So that is the last 10 years. But the story before that was the story of the decline. So McClatchy, one of the largest newspaper chains, bought the Star Tribune in the mid 90s or in late 80s for $1.3 billion. That was the highest price ever paid for a single newspaper property until Murdoch bought the Wall Street Journal. About 20 years later, McClatchy sold the Star Tribune to private equity for $500 million. So you can see the deterioration. And that came as is well documented, the decline in advertising, the decline in profitability that was driven by the introduction of the internet as a replacement principally for advertising.
And just to give us a sense of that scope, like what was the annual advertising intake of the Star Tribune at its height, and then as that was declining and private equity made the purchase?
Well, the earnings of the Star Tribune at its peak were about $120 million a year. And at that time, the multiple one would pay for a media property and even a newspaper was about 12 or 13 times. So that's how you got to that $1.3 billion purchase price. When they sold it, the earnings were probably about $30 million, and the multiples had declined to, a fraction of what, they weren't 13 anymore. So, roll forward from that, private equity, after buying the newspaper, leveraging it with about $400 million of debt of the $500 million purchase price, went bankrupt about within 18 months as the profitability continued to fall. So it's not been the case that the newspaper was never profitable, was unprofitable. It was just over leveraged. Mm-hmm. So there was so much leverage that they couldn't afford to make the interest payments and the principal payments. So that's when private equity bankrupted the company. It was taken over by the lenders. And that is the moment in time where I entered the picture. I was hired by the lenders who became the owners to effectively, the company had actually emerged from bankruptcy months before I got there. And then my goal was to build a new business model for the future.
And what is the ownership structure today?
Yeah, so that group of lenders that took over the company, their goal, of course, was to sell the company. And my job was, among them, was to find a buyer for us. So very fortunately, in 2015, 5 years after we got there, we were able to find a local business person by the name of Glenn Taylor. Glenn is a local, is a Minnesotan through and through. He is best known probably as the owner of the Minnesota Timberwolves NBA basketball team and the Minnesota Lynx. And so like in Boston with John Henry, where he owns the Red Sox, we got a sports owner. But Glenn was also a politician in his past. He was Minnesota House Republican, and he's very interested in civic events. He's got a large printing company, a lot of agricultural businesses. He bought our company, and we're grateful that he did, because his point of view is really he's hands off. We run the company. He bought it. We're responsible for maintaining it. He doesn't send us money, but he doesn't ask us to dividend any money to him. Whatever we earn is ours to keep and invest. But
it's not a philanthropic endeavor either.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I really do want to get into solutions, and I'm just going to preview that I have a strong bias in this area. I'm a local news operator, publisher in my own right, as well as the founder of a venture philanthropy firm. My bias is commercial models are not going to be sufficient to get us the local news we need. We must embrace nonprofits. So I'm going to really push on our two wonderful publishers here. And it's going to be a fun discussion. But really quickly, I just want to establish for anyone who might have any doubts, why does this matter? Wouldn't it be okay for us just to let the market forces push local news into a decline? Perhaps if the market isn't able to sustain it, maybe we don't need it. Maybe that's because people don't want to pay for it, and maybe they never did. Maybe we don't need to care. So, Michael, I'm going to return to you with this question. What's your answer to that? Why are you doing this? You and Nykia are talented business people who could be taking your talents to much more profitable arenas. Why does it matter?
Yeah, no, I came and took this job. It was a return to my hometown. I'd been in New York for 34 years working for Time Incorporated in national media. I took the job because it was my hometown and I cared and I thought it was important. And the reason it's important is that it's a pillar of local society and community. I mean, it is not only the town square, but it is the originator of most of the news in the local markets. I mean, there have been studies to say that the local newspaper actually produces about 85% of the news in a marketplace. A lot of it is disseminated from television and radio, writing off the stories of the newspaper that the newspaper created. And journalism is a labor-intensive business. It takes us, 240 is what we think it takes us to cover a metropolitan area of about 3 million people. But we also consider ourselves a state paper. So we are available and for sale, and we cover the entire state of Minnesota. But it's absolutely critical for people, obviously David said it at the outset, for people to be informed, for our democracy to function, for us to serve as fact checkers, for us to uncover, shine the light, uncover everything that's going on in our community, hold government to account, all those things that I think, I'm sure all our students are familiar with.
Nykia, what's your answer to that question? Why put your energies into local news?
So I certainly echo Michael's comments, and I'll just add two to that. When I was asked to be this chief operating officer at the time, I spoke to my family, and my uncle Mac really made it very simple for me to determine whether or not to enter this industry. He said, Nykia, if you help turn this thing around, it could be one of the best business stories in the last quarter century. And if you don't, the industry was failing anyway. And so that last part lets you know just how much society thinks about and has appreciated news, because we sort of turned our back on them over the years. And then the other comment is, many people understand journalism as journalists being the first draft history, right? And so if you think about the 30,000 journalists who've lost their jobs since 1995, and you do a simple multiple of that, how many millions of first drafts of history have we lost, right? And so stories are being told every day. people are being impacted every day, whether that's via environmental injustices, social injustices, political injustices, and everything in between. It's not just holding the power to account, it's helping us understand how to navigate our personal communities. And without that first draft, without that true training that journalists have actually undergone in order to ensure that that truth is still sort of that common thread throughout those stories to help inform as opposed to affirm, then what are we here for? We don't understand how to navigate our society.
Right, and I think we're reaping a lot of the rewards of lacking a first draft of history, lacking a public town square. Tom, there's been research studies about the effects of local news on democracy. Can you give just a quick summary of what those findings are?
Yeah. Well, first off, and this isn't from a study, but it's more anecdotal. The problem when you don't have local journalists is you don't know what you don't know. And people in power, if they're unobserved, they behave worse. I remember Senator McCaskill, when she was in the Senate, told a story about being the Attorney General of Missouri. And she said, when I had to make a difficult decision, I would think to myself, how will I explain this to? And she identified the specific reporter at the St. Louis Post-Dispatch who covered her. How am I going to explain this decision to that reporter? Because I'm going to have to defend it publicly in the newspaper. That's not quantified in a study because now you're trying to identify things that didn't happen because no one was watching. But what the study suggests is that the more robust a local news ecosystem, the better the economic opportunities and economic activity are in markets. There's a new study out that suggests that when you have fewer local journalists in a market, the politics is more polarized in that community. The people in the community are more polarized from each other because their political framework is more nationalized. The other thing that kind of goes along with the economic activity is there's just knowledge gaps about how do I get services, how do I solve problems, how do I get my welfare check or my vaccine or whatever it is. There's just less information about that, and so people in a community are information impoverished and their lives suffer.
So holding power to account and watching power, how it works, but also informing everyday people about how to take advantage of the resources of.
Yeah, and when we talk about holding power to account, there's a difference between what I would call watchdog or investigative reporting, of which there's some, but there's never been as much as there should have been or as much as journalists would like to acknowledge. But there's a very powerful effect from what I would call witness-bearing reporting, which is people simply showing up at civic councils. And for all that I've written books about TV news and the rest, Mike is right that the data is very clear in multiple studies, including one last year from Duke, that most information about civic affairs in local communities originates in newspapers because there are 100 there's 100 stories, even in a denuded newspaper, a modern newspaper today. There's about 100 stories that appear in the newspaper. There's about 12 that appear in a nightly newscast. And most, we'll get into the whole debate about commercial versus nonprofit, or which ownership structure is best. But a general interest publication, whatever you call it, whether it's a newspaper or digital only, that creates a common public square where there is more than one topic covered, has the effect of creating a gathering place. And it's not clear whether that public square survives.
So let's get into solutions and the different paths forward, because Nykia put it pretty starkly, 30,000 journalists out of jobs, tens of billions of dollars annually in advertising has been lost, even for the rare cases of a newspaper that stands in a local community with a 240 person newsroom like you have, Michael. it still is not enough, not nearly enough what we currently have today. And so clearly something has to change dramatically going forward. I want to ask each of you kind of to talk about the solutions. And let's start with you, Nykia, since this is exactly the challenge you face. You've come into the Sun Times when it's really down, and now you're working on a turnaround strategy. What tools did you see available to you? What different paths could you have pursued to do a turnaround, and what are you on? And after we have this final round of discussions in about 15 minutes, we're going to take audience questions. So Nykia, what were the available solutions that you studied when you first got in, and what did you pick?
Perfect. So just by way of history, I was a consultant by trade. So after business school, I became a consultant for 8 years. Most people that know me know that I define a consultant as a business doctor. But being a business doctor and having worked across multiple industries, I was able to bring all of the cross training from the multiple industries to bear to this economic.
Like a one-on paper hanger here, but...
Hi, David. We hear your. Okay, thank you. So I was able to bring all of those tools to bear. I came in understanding that because the house was on fire, the first sort of overall philosophy that I had was that there are no sacred cows. Everything outside of labor, intentionally, is up for grabs. Every printing and distribution contract, every vendor that we have is up for grabs, and we have to scrutinize all of these things. Having been a consultant for years, I've always seen that most people, when they try to cut costs, the first thing that they go to is labor. I've never agreed with that, because at the end of the day, once you skinny that organization down, you will have to turn around and face the facts that you will still have a growth problem if you plan to survive. And so I look at labor as something that you should consider last, if at all. And so looking at every contract is how we were able to sort of find those $17 million. And we really pushed and pushed and pushed. A lot of people said that it wasn't possible. There were some decisions that I had to make on the fly. And Tom, your organization, actually, my VP of circulation and I were interviewed, I want to say a week and a half ago, to talk about one of the decisions that I had to make on the fly, because I was very sort of confident in finding a different solution. I've done some consulting.
What was that?
I'm sorry?
What was the decision?
Sure. Okay, absolutely. So we had a call center that was in South America, and it was costing a significant amount of money. The contract was up. All of my Midwest clients were complaining that they did not understand what the person was saying on the other end because it was a language barrier, and I had to find a way to cut costs. And so leveraging my experience when I worked as a consultant at McDonald's, what I noticed about McDonald's is they partnered with a lot of startups. And so why would you want to do that? A startup wants to have a big name brand on their portfolio. A big name brand wants to say, okay, well, give me your innovation. And so that marriage sometimes actually works. So what did we do? I went and scoured the United States and found a startup in the call center industry. And I said, okay, I'll partner with you. You want my brand. I want your innovation. Let's partner and see what happens. And we've saved over $750,000 just by moving it stateside, when everyone else said that it wasn't possible. Not only that, it was built for a pandemic world. All of these call center reps are actually working from home. So when the pandemic hit, I didn't have to worry about where people were in terms of specific locations and moving back home. They were able to just continue working with us in that capacity. And that was
servicing subscriptions. They're servicing subscription.
Say that again?
The call center is doing subscription customer service.
Subscription customer service, but also any type of complaint, right? So if there's a paper that was not delivered, the snowstorm, anything that they have a complaint about as it relates to content, they are sort of they corral all of that stuff and sort of send it out to the proper places in the business.
Awesome. All right. So finding cost inefficiencies, reducing cost structures, finding opportunities for innovation. That's one side of the problem. Mike or Michael? Michael.
Mike is fine.
It's lovely. My old friend, Mike. Mike, what about the money in side, right? We heard about the huge declines in advertising revenue, and Tom described how digital companies, especially Google and Facebook, have sucked up the advertising money. How are you making money?
Yeah, so when I got to the Star Tribune, my premise that I was operating on was that we needed to transform the company into increasingly a subscription-first company. So I came from Time Incorporated, which was the most sophisticated magazine publisher in the world. That company always had half of its revenue from readers, from consumer marketing, and half from advertising. And that was a healthy balance because consumer revenue persists through economic downturns. It's long lasting because it's a subscription based where you have continuous renewal. So my goal when I got there was to actually increase the percentage of our revenue that came from circulation and consumer marketing. And that's what we set out to do. I didn't set out to have that happen just by having advertising revenue vanish. But that is one way to get to a higher percentage of circulation revenue. In any event, we adopted about a year after I got there and about 6 months after the New York Times, a principle that we were going to put all of our content behind a paywall and get into the digital subscription business as the most important way in which we could enhance and grow our subscription revenue base. And we've essentially followed the New York Times playbook almost virtually. And my goal was to show that that playbook could work for a major metro paper. And so far it is. Now, they have scale.
Are you a 50-50?
We are actually about 60% subscription revenue and 40% advertising revenue. So
how many subscribers?
I'm sorry?
How many subscribers is that?
We have about 350,000 on Sunday, 240,000 during the week. If you look at the top circulating net paid newspapers in the United States, the largest is the New York Times, second is the LA Times, Washington Post, Chicago Tribune, and we are fifth. So we're the fifth largest circulation paper in the United States at this point. So we've had some great success with this formula. And that's what so for us, if you can get your revenues that are growing to be a larger share of your overall revenue, mix will work in your favor. So today, only 20% of our revenue still comes from print advertising. So that's a great thing because as that continues to diminish, it's only 1/5 of our revenue base now, whereas circulation is 60%, and we've been able to grow our circulation revenue. So that mix effect works in your favor over time and has helped for us to essentially stabilize our revenues. Last year, of course, with the COVID pandemic was an exception. We did lose revenue last year, but up until that, the 3 years before that, we'd been stable.
And how did you manage the revenue loss?
Last year, actually, we had to match cost reductions to the revenue loss, to keep our earnings relatively stable. Some of that happened naturally as we saw the size of the paper diminish by necessity because the coverage areas disappeared. So if there were no sports, there were no live arts, there was nothing to write about. So the physical paper became a bit smaller last year. Newsprint prices fell because of lack of demand for newsprint. That offered us some savings. There was no travel and entertainment to be done. So those expenses all fell by the wayside. So, and then we did also have a modest furlough program for all of our employees, 3 days per quarter, which was effectively a 3% pay reduction for them. And we reinstated that in the fourth quarter once we got through the terrible second and third quarters of last year.
And is your belief that this model could be adopted everywhere in the country, and that if we just ran smarter local subscription businesses, we would have sufficient reporters on the ground to kind of serve the democracy?
Well, there's a virtuous circle, and the problem is a lot of places have cut their news reports so much that I'm not sure you're going to be able to convince people that the quality is there to subscribe. So once you do that, it's a little bit like Nykia said, after the people are gone and the beats are gone, it's a little bit hard to build that back because you'd have to presume you could grow revenues to be able to add that staff back. But essentially, I think the model should be viable for markets that have enough scale. Now, I don't know how deep that goes, if that's only 15 markets or whether that might be 50 markets. But basically the problem with the small markets, the really tiny papers, is they were 100% print revenue based. They had no digital platform. They had no digital advertising. They definitely had no digital subscriptions. So there was nothing to offset the loss of the print ad revenue that was hoovered up by Facebook and Google. And Tom, the most recent number is in local ad markets, Google and Facebook are 77% now of the local ad market. So the solution is not as obvious for those small markets where they are starting from zero with digital platforms.
So Tom, do you think that kind of the story we're hearing here from Nykia and Mike is that there were business decisions that were made poorly by owners of local newspapers, cutting labor first rather than retaining the quality product, and thereby failing to transition to the kind of mixed commercial revenue model that Mike is describing. He's been able to transition to, and it sounds like Nykia is working on a transition in that direction. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, and it predates the internet. There was a debate. I mean, you have to realize that newspaper penetration, the number of percentage of people who are reading newspapers has been declining since the advent of television after World War II. And the circulation of the total circulation of newspapers began to decline about 1990. So there was a debate inside the industry about whether newspapers were a mature industry, whether if you improved your product, you could grow your audience or not. And there was a philosophical divide. And there were places that believed that quality could grow the business. And there were places and companies that believed they should start slowly harvesting this industry that was never going to grow, but slowly shrink. Then introduce the internet and things accelerate. And you have the philosophical divide becomes even more intense. And then you have, and as the business becomes more difficult, you've got owners, particularly some hedge funds, that come in and say, we're going to start buying these properties at a very low price and continue to cut costs, but continue to make profits. I do believe that one point that's really important for folks listening to understand is when you shift from a advertising model to a subscription model, everything about how you measure the quality of your business shifts. In an advertising world, a page view is the most important thing. Clickbait, how many eyeballs can I get to this piece of content? In a subscription world, all of a sudden you're thinking about what kind of content makes people come back more often every month? How long did they read this story? Is this the kind of story that subscribers will read? And suddenly you start evaluating your data based on, is this content of such high value that more people might want to be willing to pay for it, rather than will a drive-by person, virality becomes much less important and sustained value becomes much more important.
And I'm gonna say, here's my opinion on this question. My opinion on this question is that bad business decisions are just one part of the story. The other part of the story is that journalism, local journalism of the kind we're talking about, has always been a public good subsidized by commercial kinds of content that were bundled together in a way that is just impossible to do going forward. And so, Mike, my view is a bit more cynical than yours, I guess. I think there's very few local markets that can sustain anything close to the number of original reporting resources we need on the ground in the absence of another intervention. And so I'm a big proponent of adding to the mix, not just independently owned newspapers that are not seeking profits, but just running sustainable businesses. We have to add to that mix nonprofits subsidized by philanthropy, and also by even potentially taxpayer dollars. I'm open to add to the mix, and that's happening in Minnesota. It's happening in Chicago. It's not happening enough, but it's the much faster growing than any newspaper has managed to do with digital.
Yeah, and let me just say, Elizabeth, that these models they're not mutually exclusive. You can have a newspaper that is attracting philanthropic dollars. You can have a newspaper that, and government subsidy in the form of, tax breaks and other things have always been part of the mix. I think it's since no one has crossed this chasm, we don't know what the successful model entirely will be.
Yeah, the scale issue is what I worry about. So for in Minnesota, for example, we have a publication called MinPost, a digital only. It's one of the best in the country. It has an annual budget of $3 million. For that budget, it can produce 4 or 5 stories a day by a half dozen journalists. It just doesn't have the financial engine that you need to really, so they have some coverage areas where they do pretty well and they put a lot of their resources, but in terms of covering the waterfront, it's very difficult to scale that philanthropic model.
Well, I'd love to have a long debate about that because I have a strong opinion to the contrary, but let's go to the first student here who has a question. Allison, you're watching via Facebook. Can you join us and ask your question? Oh, wait, no, I'm going to read your question for you. My apologies. Panelists, do websites, and this is actually for you, Nykia, do websites like Block Club Chicago and crowd-funded organizations like that, are they a possible model for the future? Nykia, can you describe what Block Club is for those who don't know and take that question on?
Absolutely. So it is my understanding that Block Club is a not-for-profit organization. They do have a subscription model. And what they do is they sort of curate content block by block or neighborhood by neighborhood here in Chicago. So not only do you get a breadth of understanding of what's happening in the city at large, but there are ways for you to sort of stem it down to what's happening in the West Loop, which is the Loop, which is other things. As a pure business person, I would say you continue to bring competition into the market until profits go down to zero. Lots of companies are trying to fight and make money in that model. Is there room for it? Block Club seems to have that sort of not-for-profit status and marrying that with a subscription model to innovate to see if that happens. But to Tom's point, right now we're all sort of neck and neck. We know what the answer is, but no one has actually been able to outside of the Northeast. And certainly, Michael, your company, but for the most part around the country, most of the people have not been able to sort of cross that line to see what really works. I do believe that the more competition that is in the model, the more that we can innovate and bring your best company to bear to ensure that journalism stays sort of at the forefront of people's minds. So the more entrants in some cases, the better, and may the best model win.
That's terrific. Sophie has the next question, and she's going to join us by video for her question.
Well, my name is Sophie Hare. I'm a second year in the college, and I'm majoring in public policy. So I have a question regarding trust and the media. A lot of trust has been lost in the media in recent years. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts on how local newspapers can work to rebuild this lost trust. And if you think that people typically trust their local journalists more than, say, national journalists. And if so, how can local and national journalists work together towards the end of rebuilding trust?
Great question. Thank you. I see Tom nodding. I know you have a lot of thoughts on this. We can start with you, and then I'm going to ask the other two to join in too.
Yeah, so I did, for 16 years, I ran the media research at the Pew Research Center, and where we did a lot of these studies. And at one point, we started developing an alternative question, which is we asked people not what's your trust in the media, but think of the media that you use most often. And what's your trust with that? And at API, we did a study where we split the sample and we asked half the people about the media, and then we asked half the people about the media they use most often. We also asked people, when you think of the media, what do you think of? And the answer that we get back most often is cable. So when, because you see it, it's there, you can visualize it. So people, when they talk about trust in media, are reacting to often media that they don't like. They sort of think of the worst case scenario. Basically, the answer is that when you ask people about the media they use most often, the numbers go up. They about double, depending on which question you're asking, but there's about twice as much trust. That tends to be local media, but it may not always be local that people use most often. I will tell you, the numbers are not great. They're just twice as good as they are when you ask about national media. The other thing is what goes into trust. If you look at the trust data, it began to decline in the 1980s. That's when we began to see this very steady, and half of the decline in trust happened before the internet. What was going on? Well, two things, basically. One, we had the advent of new technology in television, and we went from 4 channels in every market to like 40 and now 4,000. So choice gave people the ability to say, I don't really like this media that I've been relying on all these years, and trust numbers went down. The other thing that happened is we deregulated electronic media, and talk radio and partisan media was suddenly much more able to flourish, and marketed itself as the antidote to a liberal press. Talk radio, I mean, Rush Limbaugh basically would have been against the law in the 1970s, but we deregulated and got rid of rules that would have prohibited it.
And can you explain what the rules used to be that would have prohibited?
Yeah, there were sort of complicated Byzantine rules, but one was called the Fairness Doctrine and one was called the Equal Time Rule. And woven together, they meant that if you said something, you had to let the other side have an equal chance to rebut that point of view. And so if you had a show like Rush Limbaugh, you would have had to have another show that was sort of on the other side. And you couldn't have a whole network that was one-sided and dedicated itself to being, an opposition. I mean, Fox News would have been, there was a time when you couldn't have had a Fox News.
Mike, what's your take on the question about trust in local news and how it relates to overall declining trust in all institutions and in the media in particular? I'm in particular interested in your thoughts on, I know from my experience running Chalkbeat and now VoteBeat, which covers, both of which are local reporting organizations in many different cities across the country. We hear often from especially communities of color that they have felt disenfranchised from their local news, like not represented, not seen as a customer, and represented poorly. What's your answer to the question of does your newspaper have the trust of your community?
I'm sorry, was that for me?
Yes, Mike.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I think Tom is correct. As you get closer to your local community, trust tends to grow. It's sort of like, do you trust the government? No. But do you trust your local senator? Yes, more than the national government. But clearly, we've got room to grow in terms of representation of our community. And if that was ever driven home to us, it was this year with the events in Minneapolis. And so we've really redoubled our efforts to ensure that our newsroom is made up of individuals who represent the makeup of the community. We've always paid particular attention to making sure that we had diverse faces on the front page of the newspaper. We actually monitor that, and we also monitor.
You mean in the stories themselves? Are you
in the stories themselves, in our coverage, and whether in fact those stories are negative stories or positive stories. We've always kept an eye on that, but increasingly that's even more important. We've made a major push this year on hiring diverse journalists and have had some tremendous success. 8 of the
industry
last 12,
is predominantly white, and ownership and leadership of newsrooms in particular white men.
Across our company, our demographics reflect that of our community, but they did not. The higher you went up in the organization. But 8 of our 12 hires in the newsroom this year were people of color. So we've really made a lot of progress on that, and that's something we're taking increasingly seriously.
Nykia, what can local media do to rebuild trust?
So I've only been in the industry for 3 years, so let's sort of bookend that. But it is really my opinion that we can do lots of things internally. We can hire the right people. We can become a more diverse workforce. We can get on the right platform. But if we are not out into the community, all we are doing is moving around deck chairs, sort of making ourselves feel better, but we've forgotten to bring the community along. Sophie, as it relates to your question, it's funny, the first thing that I thought about when you were talking about trust, my first question would be, how do you segment that market? I would much more likely believe, certainly with respect to my leaders, that the people who are sort of more seasoned, 50 plus, they would have a different trust response versus people of your generation. And so at the end of the day, we can do all of these things to make sure that we are checking the box for the community to know what we've done. But if we are not out there beating the streets and trying to gain their trust in person, obviously we're talking about this in a pandemic world, but we've got to figure out then how to do it in a virtual world. We've got to remind people while we're here what our mission is to the community and to society. And I think that's how we start doing it. That's the only way to grow.
Thank you, Nykia. Thank you, Sophie, for your great question. We're going to have one last question from Paul, who's going to turn on his video right now.
Hi, everyone. So first, thanks so much. This is a fascinating topic and one that's very near and dear to me. So I'm Paul. I'm a second year at Booth, so the business school, currently actually out on the West Coast. And I was curious just if everyone could weigh in on this idea of kind of the platform licensing. So sort of what we're seeing in Australia with the lawsuits against Google. So first, with kind of bipartisan consensus, maybe actually moving towards something. One, do we think it has a shot? Two, how would that impact how you think about your own organizations? And then three, with kind of the specter of these hedge fund roll-ups, right, of the consolidation of regional media, does this help stop that? Or does it just make it worse? If this
were great. I think we're going to have to take your 3-part question and with our final 1 minute, chop it down. So Mike, I saw you nodding and having some thoughts here.
So the News Media Alliance, which is our industry organization, of which Tom's organization is part of, is actually introduced legislation, safe harbor legislation, which would enable news publishers and perhaps broadcasters as well to band together to have a fair negotiation with the platforms. And that legislation will be reintroduced in the spring. My own senator, Amy Klobuchar from Minnesota, is the lead on that. We think that may have a fair shot in the current climate today with the pressure that the platforms are coming under. The notion there would be basically to negotiate financial compensation for the platform's ability to crawl our websites and the access to our news.
And I'll just add on a final note that just as the commercial local news publishers have organized and made put forward ideas to Congress, so too are nonprofit local news publishers doing that. And there is kind of an overlap, but not perfectly intersecting circles there because of the problem of chains and hedge fund owned companies. I think some of the things being pushed forward by industry associations are actually not going to help at all, whereas others can. And so there's a lot of fun in this conversation. I want to say thank you to Paul. Thank you for your conversation. Thank you, Nykia, Tom, and Michael for your participation. Awesome. I learned a lot. I really learned a lot about from all 3 of you, and I intend to continue learning that. Thank you to David Axelrod and the IOP for organizing us today and to bringing attention to this really important topic.
Can I add a thank you to Eric for his service, and welcome to the University of Chicago.
Yes. Oh, thank you so much for saying that. Thank you, Eric, for your introduction and organizing. All right. Take care. Thanks, guys.